Hey there, welcome to Farmcraft. My truck needs a new clutch. It also has some oil leaks in the transmission and the PTO and some other things, but the clutch is the main issue. I started working on this in a previous video and pulled the transmission, nearly dropping it in the process. If you haven't already seen that, you might want to watch that first. I really appreciate all the comments and help that was offered by the audience in finding parts for this thing. Thanks to your help, I have all the parts. In case you missed it, I did a short video on weighing this transmission using a lever, and it weighs 536 pounds, 244 kilograms, or about 4.5 Johnsons. Let's get on with this repair. So when I originally saw the state of this gasket, my intention was to take this off and replace it. This gasket is actually a shim. There's a gear inside the PTO, there's a gear inside the transmission, and those mesh, and the spacing is determined by the thickness of this gasket here. It works fine like it is. If I take it apart, then I'm gonna have the trouble of finding the end play and everything. It's just not worth it. This is one of those, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I did notice there were 2 nuts missing off of the studs, and I want to replace these. This one, I've already threaded on there. The threads are a little gummed up, but it goes on. And I cleaned off the threads, so I'm gonna put a little blue Loctite on it, just so it doesn't fall off again. That's more than I wanted, but doesn't matter. Like they say, the bigger the gob, the better the job. This one here, this little cutout on the housing doesn't allow a nut to go on. And I could grind away at the housing, but that just seems like a bad idea. I think I'm gonna cut the stud off. By the way, this gasket does not leak. I'm bordering on breaking the rule of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because I could probably just keep running it just like it is. My thought is, though, if another nut comes off of there, it's gonna start leaking. So why not try to get one on here if I can? Thread it on. This is a grade 8 nut, so it shouldn't have any problem sort of recutting whatever's there. The Loctite. Click! So you remember that broken bolt I had on my U-joint? Oh, that bolt broke off. It's right there now. So let's get this fixed up. I'm going to start out with heating it. We'll try a left-handed drill bit and see if we can't win the lottery. If this doesn't work, I'll be welding some nuts on here. Alright, I'm using a right-handed drill bit, going down a size. So now I'm going to go up one size and go to left-handed and get this thing to catch and see if it'll come out. Before I do that, I'm going to put a little heat on it again. It moved. Look at that. Left-handed drill bit for the win. So I've got some seals, and those are ready to go in, but getting the old ones out. Best way that I've found is to drive a self-tapping screw into the seal and then pull it out. And what's really handy for that is a slide hammer. So I'm finally gonna break down and make one out of this old set of vice grips. That's the bolt that goes in there. So let's make this into a slide hammer, and one that'll be useful to us in the future. So now I can drive those screws in, grab hold of them with the vice grips, and then pull them out. And it's threaded, so if I ever need maybe a longer throw or a bigger hammer, I can just make something up real quick. And it didn't even hurt my vice grips. Still just a pair of vice grips. So this is the back of the transmission, and this seal right here was leaking quite a bit. So in order to change that, I've got to get this yoke off of here. It looks like somebody did some welding or something on this thing. Yeah, that's what they did. They welded this nut, trying to keep it from backing off. Well, it certainly won't back off. Kind of hack like me was working on this thing, welding this thing on here. I think that's good. The biggest socket I have is 2 inches, except the one I have for an axle nut, which is like 4. And my 2-inch socket won't go on there. We'll put some lube on there that won't do anything except make me feel better. See if we just can't do it with a hammer and a chisel. Is it moving? I believe it is. My new best friend. What a handy tool. Why didn't I make that a long time ago? Here you can see how the speedometer works. The speedometer cable goes right in there, comes through here, and if you look up in there you can see there's a shaft with a little spur gear on it, and it's basically a worm driven gear. So when this spins, you see that there's threads there spinning that little gear. So I cleaned this up with some emery cloth. You can see right here is where the seal was running. And I can feel that. You do not want to put the new seal in the same spot because of that. This one was flush with the surface, and there's plenty of room for it to go back a little further. So that's what I'm going to do. That will put the seal back into this area that cleaned up really nicely. You can see some marks on it, but you can't feel anything. That should do just fine. So new seal, dab of grease. Make sure you grease that because it'll run dry and tear your brand new seal up in no time. You want to be careful not to dislodge the spring in here that gives it spring tension to seal. Some people will pack those with grease on a seal that it looks like the spring might come out. This one is really well in there. I don't think I have to worry about it, so I'm not going to do anything. Not wanting to go in at all. Sometimes I hate seals. Sorry, seals, it's just the way it is. Alright, seal, we can be friends again. There we've got it flush. So that's where it was. And a lot of times the old seal is a perfect thing to hammer on the new seal. Okay, I like it. You can put the yoke back on. I don't know if you can see right there, the lip is kind of folded under, just for like an inch. So, I don't know if I can do it and hold the light at the same time. That thing really doesn't want to be any other way. I'd really rather not scrape right on the edge of the seal. And if I pull it out, it just stays in like that. Don't like that. I'm gonna rub that area and kind of train it, because it's every time I've put it on, it's right there. It wants to fold under. If I can get it just to stay just a second, then it can spring back against the shaft and it'll be fine. All right. Hey, that worked. The seal is running right inside that groove, and it's not folded under anymore. Perfect. Okay. So my thought was, I looked up the torque spec. I was thinking I was going to shave this down on the belt grinder until it did fit my socket. But the torque spec for it is 525 foot-pounds. So I have a whole other torque wrench that I use for that. the hammer and the chisel. Basically, you get this thing as tight as you can. 525 foot-pounds is a whole lot of torque. I don't even think my torque wrench goes up to that. I'm also going to put some blue Loctite on it. I'm calling it done. Click. The PTO is also leaking around this control lever shaft, so next we're going to fix that. That's right where it's leaking. This is a indicator to tell you if the PTO is engaged. And when you pull the PTO lever, you're twisting this, and that causes this thing to go back and forth. That is engaged in this, and when it comes this way, the gears engage. And so now the PTO is engaged, and now it's disengaged. Supposed to be an O-ring right there. I had already had this apart. I took it apart so that I knew what to order. New O-ring. There we go. PTO spins freely, and now it's engaged, and the whole transmission's turning. This just came in today. This is the clutch, and I really hope I'm not about to be disappointed. I hope this is the right part. The company that sent this to Napa apparently only had one in stock, and I don't know, it just makes me nervous. Well, that looks different. That looks a lot different. And it was supposed to come with an alignment tool, which it did not. Okay, more challenges. I'm not even sure that's going to go on the shaft. That's really... Nope. Damn it. Damn it. Nope. I was hoping this was going to be a fun unboxing video, but yeah, that's a bummer. Wrong clutch. I've got a lot of good comments and suggestions from people on what to do with this, and appreciate everybody's comments. A very common one is to, just find it in a junkyard. Yes, I'm sure there's a junkyard out there that has one of these. It's just a matter of finding it. The other common thing that people said is, why don't you do just what you did with the transmission jack and just weld this back up and then turn it down to what you need and put the new bearing on. That's a totally legit way to fix it, except this is cast iron. This isn't steel. While it is possible to weld to cast iron, it's not something I've ever done, and it's just not something that I want to experiment with, only to find that it fails and then I have to pull this transmission again. It's not a very accessible part to be monkeying around with. What I think I'm going to do, actually, is put this in the lathe, get it running true based on the inside bore, turn this off, bore it out, and then machine a steel bushing that will interference fit in there. And then I can turn that steel bushing down to whatever I need and put the new bearing on. I think that's the most reasonable way. Other options, and one day maybe I'll come across a machine where I really have to do this. It would be kind of fun, would be to just make a new one, like totally new, cast it. You could even make something like this out of bronze. Bronze is easier to cast than cast iron. It's lower temperature. If I can do cast iron, I mean, how cool would that be to melt down brake rotors or something and make the part you need? This should be my bearing. I got this straight from a bearing supplier. I called them and asked them about the collar, and they said they only had the bearing. And there we go. Kind of big. Well, would you look at that? That's the whole thing. I can't believe that. It's the whole darn thing. Well, you win some, you lose some. I lost on the clutch, so we'll keep working on that one, but wow. It was $84, I think. And I thought, well, that's an awful lot to pay just for a bearing like this. It is a pretty big thrust bearing. Figured it's 2022, things cost more, but honestly, for that, $84 seems pretty darn reasonable. Got a new bearing. How about that? Alright, I got a new rear main seal. Looks right. That's a $35 seal. It is pretty big though. So self-tapping metal screw. Take a little bit of that oil and put it on the seal itself. You don't want the seal to run dry, you'll cook it. And I put a little bit on the outside just to help it go in. This thing in here. Start out just pushing it. Oh, and that's nice. Wow. Whoa. I have to say that thing went in a little too easy. Huh. Am I worried about that? I don't like the fact that that went in so easily. Man, that would suck to put this all back together and have a leaking rear main. Alright, I've been deliberating on this for a little while and I'm just not happy with that. If this thing's got enough blow by, the crankcase, especially if your crankcase breather ever clogs, it's going to build pressure in there and it could push that seal right out while you're driving down the road. I mean, that would just be a disaster. So, you know, unfortunately parts are often not to spec, even though they say they are. I mean, it's the right number. I think that seal's just too small. I've ordered another seal, so I'm probably not going to reuse it, but I am just going to drill a small hole and see if I can get it out with a pick. I'm thinking if I can't find a seal that fits, maybe I could use a gasket making product around the outside of this one and lock it in position. This small hole is something I could fix and potentially reuse this seal. Oh, this just keeps getting better. Alright. Love that. The end of my pick snapped off and is now in the bottom of my oil pan. Probably never to cause a problem, but that kind of sucks. Yeah, I'm just getting this thing out of here. You can see it move here. Definitely needed to come out. I'm gonna reach in there with a magnet, see if I can do anything. There's not enough clearance for that magnet to go down any further. And of course, no luck. Darn it. Well, most likely it'll fall to the bottom of the oil pan and then get caught by the magnet down there. Always hate having a little piece of metal inside the crankcase somewhere. Get in the wrong spot, it could really mess something up. But I think that's one of those things that actually probably happens more often than people realize and tends not to cause a problem. Hopefully I'm not going to make this problem worse, but I hate working on something and feeling like I've already done that, haven't I? Here's one of those hard drive magnets. These things are super powerful. I think I can reach that down in there. What you don't want to do is get the magnet in there and then get to where you can't get it back out. Well, in spite of trying for quite a while, can't get that magnet to really go down in there. I'm just not going to worry about it. You know, if this engine ever goes, I will happily replace it with another engine, one that I can actually get parts for. Well, would you look at that? That looks like the end of that pick. How could that be on the ground? I was very confused by this at first until I went back and looked at the footage of the pick breaking off very closely. In slow motion you can actually see the end of the pick falling. Quite surprising the way I had it wedged in there. I included all of this because this is what it's like to work on things. You'll do something and think that you've caused a problem and then sort of have to deal with that. Thankfully in this case, I actually didn't cause a problem. I just thought I did. Let's take a look at these two seals. This is my new seal. This is the old seal. Both of them have sort of rubber ridges on the edge, but the ones on the old seal have been all smashed flat because it sat in there for probably 2 decades being compressed. So I would expect that to be smaller than the new seal. Now my calipers won't reach across this. This is over 6 inches, unfortunately. So if I put these down and square it up on this side, I've got the old seal on the bottom, the new seal on the top, and we come over to this side, I can clearly see a gap where this seal is compared to the bottom seal. So the bottom compressed rubber is still bigger than the top uncompressed rubber. So yeah, I'm glad I took that out of there. We're not putting that back in. I've got another one on the way. different manufacturer. So something here that I didn't realize at first, this crankshaft has been sleeved. See that lip there? They call this the crankshaft snout. The original didn't have this outer sleeve on there. When this would wear out and the seal couldn't get a good seal on it anymore, rather than having to disassemble the whole engine and turn this down on a lathe, they just designed a sleeve that you could put over it that would then give you a new surface to run on. And mine has that sleeve there, but that sleeve has wear in it. I can feel a ridge there. It's not terrible. So now I'm trying to decide, do I want to use the sleeve that's here or take this off, which will probably be a battle, and put a new sleeve on it. This is the original one that came off of it. Wasn't leaking, but man, you're crazy not to replace it when you're in there. If I didn't, it'd be leaking next week. This is the one I ordered. It's the only one I could find of that same part number. This is the one that went in way too easy. Then I got on Rock Auto, ordered a seal based on the make and model and everything, and they sent me this. And that's when I discovered there are apparently two seals. Depends on if you have the sleeve or not. These seals are both made for the sleeve, and you can see this is much thinner than that. And one of my patrons found this sleeve for me. Thanks, Russ. You rock. And this will not go on that seal. It's not a matter of just getting the spring out of the way enough. I could force it on that, but on this side, the metal is right there. There's metal to metal interference here trying to push these together. It's not going to happen. So that seal is going back to Rock Auto. So then finally, I did find, I think this was from a place called Diesel Parts Pros. No affiliation with any of this. I was buying all this stuff. They had this seal. This one is every bit as big as the one that came out, and I think it's going to fit in there rather snugly. This is the seal that I'm going to go with. This thing with shipping was like $80. Man, everything's expensive now. So then the question becomes, do I put this new sleeve on? Getting the old sleeve off might not be that hard. I might be able to just do it with heat, but it might be a bear. I don't want to screw anything up. It's one of those things where, like, what if I take that sleeve off and then I can't get this one back on, and the crankshaft that's there is all screwed up so that I couldn't use this seal. Obviously, I have to assume that it's screwed up or they wouldn't have put the sleeve on there in the first place. It'd be nice if I could just heat it up and it would increase in its diameter and come off. What do you think? Not going to happen, is it? All right, here's the plan that's not going to work. This obviously has a lot of thermal mass and is going to take a while to heat up. The outer ring, though, I should be able to heat that up relatively fast compared to that. And then that would increase in size while this would remain smaller. And then hopefully it will come off. So let's see what happens here. Yeah, that's what I feared. Getting that thing off is just going to be a bear, and I'm just not sure it's worth it. It's one of those things where I don't want to go to the point of no return and then find out that I'm really in trouble. Maybe I'm just being a wimp. Yeah, what could I do? I could heat part of it up so that it's like red hot and then jam something underneath it while it's malleable, and I'd be able to loosen it that way. Then I'm committed to putting a new sleeve on. See the wear spot on that ring? Just not sure it's really that bad. You see that little wear area there? I can feel it, barely. The rest of the existing sleeve looks great. All right, I've made a decision. Doing some careful measuring with calipers, I've determined if I leave my seal a 1/16 proud here, that will give me a nice fresh area to run on, or I could go 200 thousandths deep and be on the other side of that area. I think this thing will go together and I think it won't leak. And you know, that's really all the rear main seal needs to do. I just think I'm gonna open a can of worms here that I don't wanna open. So I'm leaving the sleeve there. Now my measurements on this seal, it's pretty deep. It's 5/8 of an inch deep. So being a 1/16 proud is not going to be an issue with it like coming loose. It won't interfere with the flywheel or anything. And rather than catching my brand new seal on the edge of this sleeve, I think I'm going to go see if I can get a shim of some kind just to help it go over that. Clean, thin plastic that can go over that. There, now you can see that's going to guide the inner part of that seal right into position. Yeah, that seal is going to go in like it's supposed to. Using a soft hammer here. Tappy tap tap. The seal's definitely over the sleeve now. I can take that off. Now I have this piece of 16 gauge aluminum. I can put that over that. That's going to prevent me from driving it too far. And then I can just take a piece of plywood and tap it in. Oh, that looks nice. That feels good all the way around. And that seal's not going anywhere. I'm glad to have that back in. That seal was a fiasco. And that seal's running on a totally new part of that sleeve. That is not going to leak. So look at this clutch. First thing I did is I saw that says IATCO, Illinois Auto Truck Company, and a part number M1432. There's also IATCO M1744. So the very first thing I did was call IATCO, of course. They asked me a couple questions. I told them, you know, these are the part numbers. And they said, well, those are individual part numbers for a clutch assembly, but that's not the clutch part number. We need the number off the blue tag on the front. Well, there's no blue tag on the front. As soon as I told them that, they said, well, then it's not our clutch. We source parts to other manufacturers and it's going to be someone else's clutch. And they basically said, we can't help you. So then I started the round robin, going hours and hours and calls and emails, and Napa worked really hard and they found me one. It ended up being the wrong clutch after I waited a week for it. And to their credit, they took it back even though there was a big freight charge on that. I really appreciate Napa for helping me with that. Not a sponsor, but man, they worked their butts off and didn't get anything for it. Of course, I buy stuff from them all the time. So finally, at the end of my rope, I called IATCO back and said, look, I've got numbers on this clutch and I can't find it. The guy I got this time was actually a little more helpful. And he said, well, let me see what I can do. Give me those numbers. Send me some pictures. I sent him pictures and he said, oh yeah, that's our clutch. You can see where the tag was. Do you see where the tag was? Yeah, I didn't either. Right there is a stud and a stud. And the tag was over that, but apparently got ripped off. If that tag had been there, finding this clutch would have been a piece of cake because I would have had the IATCO number. It would have been one call. They would have said, here's your clutch. You got all these stamped numbers in here. Why didn't you just stamp the number on there instead of putting a stupid tag that gets ripped off? Anyway, clutch is on the way. We need to replace that pilot bearing. Got a new one right here. I just sprayed some brake cleaner in there. Close your eyes. Doing that so I don't get brake cleaner on the camera. You always want to put the numbers facing out. It doesn't really matter, but that way the next guy can see what bearing it is. So unlike when I took it out, I didn't have any choice but to basically drive it out, hitting the balls, hitting it right in the balls. And that's not good for anybody. I mean, any bearing. Trust me, I know. You only want to hit the outer race. You don't want to hit the inner race. You don't want to hit the balls. Never hit the balls. I don't know how many times I got to tell people. All right. That's good. Well, doesn't that look pretty? It looks like the right clutch. Clutches were always confusing to me just because, I don't know, it's hard to visualize what's going on in there. But they're really very simple. The only thing that's like maybe unexpected here is what happens when you push down on these fingers. But it actually, I mean, they lever, so it makes sense. This is your pressure plate. When there's no pressure on these fingers, the pressure plate goes this way. and the flywheel's over here. So if you push on the fingers, it pulls the plate. See how that's kind of a lever? If you push on this finger, it's going to pull that plate back. So the way this sits in the engine, the transmission shaft goes through here, but there's no direct connection from the engine to the transmission. It goes through this clutch. So this is connected to the transmission. This clutch cover plate is going to be bolted to the flywheel. So this is going to spin. If these fingers are pushed in and the plate comes back away from the flywheel, it's no longer pinching the friction disc, and this would be free to spin. And that's really all it is. There's either compression on the friction disc and the power transfers through, or these fingers are pushed in, pulling the pressure plate back and allowing this to spin freely. Made in the USA. Iatco was actually very helpful. He told me that they don't actually make this clutch anymore. I think they make all the separate parts of it. He had to talk to an engineer and they actually produced this clutch for me. It wasn't cheap. With shipping and everything, it was $830. You know, what are you gonna do? I was hoping it'd be more like $4 or $5, but... So this is the alignment tool. This is very necessary. When I bolt this thing to the flywheel, this is going to go into the pilot bearing on the flywheel, and like that. It keeps the clutch disc centralized where it needs to be relative to that pilot bearing, because remember, the transmission needs to go in and do the exact same thing. If it was off, you know, just a little bit, if this shifted over, you know, something like that, when you go to try to put that transmission in, remember, you can't see anything. You see the shaft go in, and then the whole bell housing is covering everything up, and you're trying to get this transmission to go in, and it just won't go, and you don't know why. Well, it's because you're hitting the pilot bearing. This alignment tool, when you're bolting it down, will make sure you have everything in line. And of course, it's the throwout bearing that presses against those to push those fingers down and is free to spin. This part will be stationary with the transmission. When you push the clutch, you're pushing this in. When you release the clutch, this will back off. This bearing will spin with the engine, but at the same time release the clutch so that now the transmission is not spinning with the engine. Let's try not to get a hernia in the process of doing this. The others are all going to get Loctite, and then I'll take that one out and Loctite it as well. Alright, so this is red thread locker, which I'm almost out of in this tube, but I have another tube. We're good. I'm going to put a little more on than I normally would because I want to also make sure this thing doesn't leak. These holes go straight into the crankcase. And for those of you worried that these bolts will never come out again, you can get them out. These bolts are pretty big. They're probably not going to break, but you just heat them up. They'll come out. You don't want flywheel bolts backing out. Something that's getting this much vibration. I mean, remember, this thing's going to be spinning constantly when the engine's running. You just don't want to mess around with that. You know it, my service manual doesn't have the torque specs for this. It's got all the other ones, but not for this. So I'm going 85 foot-pounds based on mechanic advice and the size of the bolts. First I just snug all the bolts, and then I do a star pattern, crossing the circle each time and getting progressively tighter until finally I reach the final torque. I could go ahead and start installing the clutch now, but rather than doing all that and then finding out that for some reason there's a stupid leak in that rear main seal, I am going to go ahead and start the engine. How many of you guys have ever seen an engine start from this perspective? So there's the starter right there, the little Bendix gear. My finger's on it right now, right back there. See if I can show you better. Right back there. And that will pop out, engage the teeth of the flywheel, and turn the engine over. Seeing this flywheel spinning to the running engine gave me an idea. Not something I need to do with my flywheel, but you could surface your flywheel right here. If you made a jig that bolted across the bell housing bolts and gave you the ability to extend an abrasive stone into the clutch surface, you could just progressively surface your flywheel right here using the power of the engine. That'd be kind of cool. Alright, I just ran it for a good while, had the engine warmed up, and no evidence of leaking there. Everything looks good. So I'm going to re-torque those flywheel bolts just because I've now vibrated them before that Loctite had time to cure. Oh, man, that thing's heavy. There you can kind of get the idea. Right now I don't have the bolts tightened down, so the pressure plate is not pushing against the friction disc, so I can spin this. The engine's not spinning, but once I crank those bolts down, the pressure plate's going to be pushed against that friction disc and it will be engaged, and the only way to make it spin will be to very forcefully push those in with the throwout bearing and your clutch pedal. So I am going to red Loctite these guys as well. These things, the torque spec on them is only 41 foot-pounds. A couple of them were missing when I took it off, so let's Loctite these suckers. So this has a little bit of play in it. Probably wouldn't matter. I think the transmission would go in either way, but I'm going to try to get that right in the center. Yeah, like right there. And now I'm going to start just progressively tightening these. And the shims will fall out. Now that can't move. The clutch is now engaged. So one? Oh yeah, I missed that one. That's probably what the last guy did. Why you go around twice. Or 3 times. I think this guy could use a little cleaning up. That looks a little better. So the throwout bearing needs grease. It goes right there. And the previous setup was one of these hoses screwed in there, and the other end of the hose was left just like that, hanging down through the viewport. It actually was just like that, so you had to unscrew your existing grease gun hose, screw it onto that, and grease it, which is annoying. I found the way it's supposed to be. There's a hole right there, and on the other side is a grease zerk. I can run the hose from right there, over to the throwout bearing, which will be running on that, and then there's no reaching up through the hole or anything. It's just you grease it the same time you grease everything else. Grease on these. And some grease on the face of these forks. Just greased the throwout bearing for the first time. Didn't have much grease in it when it came. I can feel it's pretty well packed with grease now, so that's all good. Before I put the transmission back in, I greased all the clutch linkage joints and anything else that was easy to access now that would not be later. Okay, so in order to avoid any danger like what happened last time, I'm going to get the jack under here, and as I'm lifting it up, I'm going to put this chain, which is attached to both leaf springs, it's not going anywhere, so that as it gets up it can't come back down. And I've also got a ratchet strap here for the back of the transmission, so I'm going to have 2 backups, and the jack will be in the middle of that. The plan is to not get a sphincter workout today. That was good. I think I'm going to replace these handles after I do this job with like a bolt head so that I can crank these with a socket. And I don't have to stick my hand under there. Alright, so now I need to make sure that the shaft is going in parallel. The easiest way to do that is to get a good measurement at the top of the bell housing and compare it to the bottom. So I'm going to reach back here with calipers because I can't see. 1.85. At the bottom I've got 1.68. So it's close, but it's too wide on top, which means it needs to tilt down. So I just spent quite a while going back and forth measuring the top and bottom of the bell housing. I got 264 on top and 2.65 on the bottom, so I'm within 10 thousandths. I think that's good enough. So now I'm not going to move that adjustment anymore, and now I can try to slide it in, get those splines to line up, which hopefully they will cooperate. I'm at that point. I just need to get the splines to line up. I need a little bit of forward pressure on this thing. So I just set up this little ratchet strap here, and I don't have much tension on it, but it's just pushing it forward. There's nothing else holding it except those splines. So now I ought to be able to reach in there with a screwdriver and turn the shaft to get the splines to match. You don't want to put bolts in there and pull this thing together. You'll be jammed against the pilot bearing or something. The bolts just exert way too much pressure. Well, that feels like they just aligned. Still doesn't want to go. I mean, those splines are hard to turn now. I feel like they're on the engine. Look at that. The money shot. All right. The front of the transmission can't fall, so I don't need this chain anymore unless I back it out. Let's get that out of the way. Use the height and the tilt to get these bolts to line up. Man, those are close. Let's go get some bolts. And once you can get about 3 of these in, and the rest of them I'm going to put blue Loctite on, and I'm going to torque them down to 60 foot-pounds. Hopefully they're not going to be backing out like they were when I took this thing apart. And man, if I can get these, we will be golden. Well, it's going right in. I got some of the blue stuff on there. Now these aren't as likely to back out because this thing isn't spinning. It's vibrated by the engine, but it's stationary. Not tightening yet, just barely snugging. I've hit my head like 20 times today. Love it. Might explain some of the stupid things I do. Okay, so I am going to torque all of these, especially the ones on top, before I take the jack out. But I'm going to torque them all, obviously, but hard to get 60 foot-pounds through this big long extension. There it is. All right, all the top bolts are torqued. I can take this jack out of here. you're used to crawling up under a vehicle and just trusting that nothing's going to fall off of there, but that thing has felt like a hazard to me for so long. Even though it's bolted to the bell housing now, it still feels like, is that thing okay? So I gotta say, the rebuilt transmission jack actually did very well. I am gonna put nuts, like a bolt head on the end of these, just so that they're a lot easier to adjust. It held that transmission just fine, and I'm glad that I had it backed up. Really should have had it backed up the first time. So I've only pulled like 2 transmissions in my life, and they were on cars, and for all practical purposes, you don't even need a transmission jack to do a car because you can bench press the transmission. I really should have done some testing before I trusted this hazard-fraught jack. The rebuilt version I think is very good, maybe a couple more tweaks on it. This is a solid transmission jack that you can use, obviously, to install a 500-pound transmission. I won't be pulling a transmission again without some backups. My stupid thought process there was I've never used a transmission jack before. I've always used a floor jack and just muscle, and I thought, oh well, this is a transmission jack, it's going to be easy. This is my inexperience showing. I naively went in there and chained the thing up and jacked it up and thought, oh, this will be a piece of cake. I can just adjust the tilt of the jack if it starts doing anything, and yeah, not so much. So I've got a 1 here and a 1 here. So that means it goes like this. There it is. Number one and number 1 all line up. Be a wonderful time to have a hammer. Red, good stuff on that. You don't want that flying off when you're going down the road. Click. Here I'm hooking the clutch linkage back up. Guys, notice anything missing here? There's something that's supposed to be on this that is not. That could have potentially caused that throwout bearing to wear out like it did. It doesn't have a return spring. That right there is supposed to have a return spring on it. There's a place for it to hook to right there. Something to pull that clutch back out and to pull that throwout bearing away from the clutch fingers. Ooh, that's pretty tough. There you can see the throwout bearing being pulled away from the fingers. I am going to go push in that clutch and see how it looks. You guys tell me what you see. Didn't feel like it was fully disengaging just by the feel of the pedal. I think it needs to be a little tighter. The clutch doesn't feel right, so I am up here looking under the dash, and there you can see the clutch pedal. And there's a lot of play. Who hates working underneath dashboards? I hate it. There's a lot of play on this joint right here. That joint right there. So I'm going to take that apart and see if I can't tighten it up. The other thing I discovered is the clutch return spring was broken. This came out straight. I just extended it a little bit and put a new hook on it so I can hook that back up. That goes up here at the top of this pedal and holds the pedal in an outward position. is certainly better. And the paper comes out. Get in there. Let's fill this sucker up with oil. I may pour it in from the top, pumping it into there. I don't have a great pump for that. I have to say this is the first time I've ever filled oil inside the cab of a vehicle. I'm just looking at this shift tower and it's pretty oily, and this is the highest part of the transmission. It doesn't look like it was coming out of the gasket. It looks like it might have been coming out of here. Of course that moves around. So I'm going to clean this thing up and maybe take that apart. The only seal is this. You know, it's still pliable. Once the spring's in here, it is pushing this down against it. You know, maybe I could stretch this spring out a little bit to make it stronger. That would be one possibility. But I think just cleaning it up, I got a bunch of crud out of here so that hopefully these surfaces will mate together better. I'm just going to put it back together and let's see if it does better like it is. That's for controlling the 2-speed rear axle. Other than that shift knob, I think I'm done. That can't be. All right, it's the moment of truth. Gonna start this thing up and see if I can back it out of here. I've fiddled with that clutch for a while. I think I have it adjusted properly, but it's really hard to tell. And I'm kind of at the point where if it doesn't work, I'm just gonna need to take a little break from this thing. Because otherwise I might pull out the sledgehammer. Let's see how it does. Definitely not releasing all the way. All right, let me crawl under there, see what I can do with the adjustment. All I'm doing is tightening this turnbuckle here just to take a little extra play out of the system. My only concern is if I get it too tight, then that throwout bearing is always going to be pushed up against those fingers. I got the clutch tightened up. Let's give this another go. We are in neutral. Emergency brake is off. She runs nice. Okay, clutch is to the floor. Hey, we're in reverse. Letting the brake off. We're not moving. Brake is off. Letting the clutch out. Hell yeah. Comes right out of gear, go into first. I didn't know this thing was actually easy to drive. This isn't bad at all. Getting into gear before was always work. Man, that is so nice. Who knew? So easy to shift now. Here you can see the clutch after I've got it adjusted appropriately. And with the engine running, you can see the throwout bearing is just barely contacting the fingers. As the clutch wears a little bit, I'll be able to loosen it up and make it perfect. Well guys, that's an amazing difference on driving this thing. So I'm really happy, really happy. I have to acknowledge, I don't think I got the best deal. Remember, I paid $6,500 for it. I think that would have been fine, but having to put in a clutch so shortly after getting it, the guy probably knew that clutch was going, and I heard it. I suspected it too, but that was a bear of a project. It was hard to get the parts were expensive, and obviously putting in a clutch on something this big is not the easiest thing in the world, at least for a jack of all trades like me. I hate to say it, but in retrospect, if I had known the parts were going to be this hard to find and this expensive, I would have looked for just finding a new engine and new transmission to put in this. Something that I'd be able to get parts for easier in the future, would have more power, and would make the truck better overall. But it's fine. A new engine and transmission would have been probably $4,000 and up, and I have $1,100 into this repair. You know, what the heck? It is what it is. It's fixed. It's so much better to drive now. I'm actually excited to go to the quarry. I'll actually be able to like stop where I want to and start when I want to and not have issues with trying to get it out of gear and things like that. This thing's been fun to drive up till now. I'm also curious. I had thought that my rear speed axle, the 2-speed axle in the rear, I had thought that was slipping previously. I'm betting that that problem's going to go away now that I fixed the clutch. The slipping was probably the clutch, not the axle. Hopefully that is a non-issue. And the only thing I have left to do on this truck, it does put diesel fuel into the oil, and I think I need to go through the injectors and probably the fuel pump. And knock on wood, that'll be it. So that'll come up in an upcoming video, but I have a lot of other things to get into first. Yeah, thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.